Have we forgotten our story as Catholics? A lot of times we forget, especially when we hear this today, as Jesus says, unless you put me first, more than father or mother, wife or children, brothers or sisters, or even your own life, you cannot be my disciple. Unless I am first and most important, unless I'm priority, Jesus says, you cannot be my disciple. A lot of times I think we lose track of why this is important, why this is good, because we've lost track of our story about how God moves in our lives and transforms and does great things even amidst those of us who are small and weak and, let's be honest, quite ordinary. There's the 80-20 principle in a lot of different organizations. You know that. You've probably experienced it. 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. You've heard that before. Well, Matthew Kelly, who's done a lot of research in terms of Catholic Church and the like, we've given out some of his books and CDs and stuff over the years. Matthew Kelly has said the 80-20 principle is not in effect in the Catholic Church. 80% of the work is not done by 20% of the people. It says 80% of the work is done by 7% of the people. 7% do the donations, 80% of the donations, 80% of the volunteer work time in the church. He says this could discourage us. We might look at that and say, we only have 7% of people truly giving and being a part of it and engaged. But he says, but look at what we've done with that 7%. It's pretty amazing. The Catholic Church in the world feeds more people, clothes more people, houses more people, educates more people, takes care of more sick people than any other institution in the whole world. Primarily working with only 7% of her population. Imagine what we could do with 8%. Imagine what we could do with 14%. If 14% of Catholics were highly engaged, giving and engaged in their work, the work of the church. I think we've forgotten our story. We've forgotten how important the work of God is. We've forgotten why we need to make Jesus a priority. And you see, it doesn't take extraordinary people. It takes ordinary people who make Jesus first. And so we reach out in love because we love God and because He has commanded us. Have we forgotten our story? It's the story we see throughout the Scriptures, where God takes the weak, the lowly, and He does great things through them. Today, thanks be to God, the Church has canonized Mother Teresa. We now have Saint Teresa of Calcutta. Praise the Lord. And with this Saint Teresa of Calcutta, we see this rather short, weak woman. And certainly when I started to get to know her, not meaning personally, but seeing her on TV and the things, she certainly was frail. And yet, because her love was great, because she made Jesus her priority, she did great things. Mother Teresa, when she was a child, fell in love with the Eucharistic heart of Jesus when she received Him in her first communion. And from that point she said, I knew I needed to give my life to God. And God did something special in her. She went over to England to learn English as part of the Loreto Sisters, and they sent her then to India, where she taught for a lot of years. And she was quite happy. But then God gave her that call within the call, where He said, go to those dark places and bring my light. She experienced all the same things we experience. She had to deal with bad breath. She had to deal with uncomfortable sleeping, She had to deal with cold showers. She had to deal with all sorts of things. She experienced doubt. She experienced darkness. The last 50 years of her life, she experienced no physical presence of God. She didn't feel any warm and fuzzies. She felt like God was distant from her. And yet, because she made God a priority, God did great things through her. She showed great love to each person because she recognized the dignity of each person that God put into them. She brought love where there was no love. I remember hearing stories about people who would be in crowds of hundreds or thousands, and Mother Teresa would be there, and they would feel like they had this special connection just with her. One woman who had gone to where Mother Teresa was receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, ran into her at one point, and she said she was talking to me and gazing upon me as if she had completely forgotten that she'd come to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. In fact, it would seem to her that she had come to this country only for that purpose, to meet this woman and to speak with her. She said, it transformed me. I know one of the Catholic speakers was going to do a talk at some conference somewhere, and he was asked for a room where he could kind of just do some work while he was waiting for his talk to be up. And so they gave him this room, so he walks in, didn't realize Mother Teresa was behind the door, and as he walks in through the door, he knocks her over. So, not so good. But so she, of course, she's Mother Teresa, she forgave very readily. And so they start talking to each other, and in the whole time that he's talking to her, she has his hand in her hand, and she's stroking his hand with love. He said, she stroked my hand so much I thought she was going to wear off all the skin on my hand. But it was with such love and intensity of love she showed to that one person. Mother Teresa didn't go out to change the world. She went to bring God's love to the person in front of her. She said this about developed countries, aka us. In developed countries, there is a poverty of intimacy of spirit, of loneliness, of lack of love. Now get this. Mother Teresa has been into the darkness and sickness of all the world. She says, there is no greater sickness today than that one. Loneliness and the feeling of being unwanted is the worst, the most terrible poverty of all. One of the greatest diseases is to be nobody to anybody. You ever feel that way? Like you're a nobody to anybody? And so she said, love, smile, reach out, touch the people around you. It doesn't take great acts, but if we have God in our lives moving and transforming us, we will bring His love to each person that we meet. She put Jesus first in her prayer, spending time with Him in the Eucharistic adoration every day, receiving Him in Mass. She touched His body at the Mass. She touched His body in the people on the streets who are dying, in the people around her. Do we put Jesus first? Is He the first priority in our lives? A lot of times we look at what that's going to cost and we say, I'm not sure I want to do that. Because He does ask us to renounce. He does ask us to give up. He does ask us to change. And sometimes we don't want to do that. And Jesus says, make sure you count the cost. You take into account what this is going to be in your life. He says, which person starting to construct a tower wouldn't stop and first see if you can build it, if you have all the resources and the money to do this. He says, you got to count the cost. See, can you do it? But the truth is, it's worth it. It's worth it. The cost of discipleship does mean there will be a change in our lives, and it may mean giving up things. But it's worth it. You may have heard the story, because I think I told it a couple of years ago, about the old man from Crete. He loved Crete, and all of Crete loved him. And as he was 99 years old and dying, he gathered his 12 sons around him, and he said, "Ah, my sons, I love Crete so much." And they said, "And all of Crete loves you." And he says, "As I'm dying, go and place me on the earth, the land of Crete, so that I can feel that land beneath my back again, that land that I love so much." And so they brought him out and placed him on the ground, and he reached his hands down into the earth and pulled up the dirt of Crete and held it to his heart, and he breathed his last. And when he opened his eyes, there he was before the pearly gates, and they're really pearly, don't you know? And as he was there, Jesus comes to him and says, "Ah, old man, you've served God, you've served my people, welcome into my joy." And then he looks down and says, "What's that? What this? What that? What this?" "Well, this is my beloved land of Crete." He says, "I'm sorry. You can't bring that in. No one can come in with dirty hands." He says, "Well, if I can't bring my Crete with me, then I'm not going in." And Jesus sadly turned and walked through the pearly gates. And the old man sat there for a while, holding on to his beloved Crete. And then the pearly gates opened again, and Jesus came out again, and he heard music and laughter and joy coming out, and Jesus said to him, "Old man, we're having a party for you inside. Come in and enter into my joy." He says, "Can I bring my Crete?" He says, "No." "Then I'm not going." Jesus lowered his head and walked back in. After a while, as the man was holding on, of course, as the moisture left the dirt, it became more and more like dust, and it became harder and harder to hold on to. Finally, the gates open again, and Jesus, the child Jesus, walks out and looks at him and says, "Old man, why don't you let it go?" He says, "But this is everything I've loved in my life, my beloved Crete." He says, "Old man, all I see is a bunch of dust." And the old man looked down, and he looked at the child Jesus. And with a heavy heart, he opened his hands, and the Ruach, the breath of God, came and blew it all away. The man sadly stood up and took the child Jesus' hands and walked through the pearly gates. But when he looked up, what do you know that he saw? But the land of Crete. Everything that he loved, now in its full glory. Does it cost something for us to be a disciple? Does it cost something to put Jesus first? Absolutely. But it's worth it. Every desire that we have, God wants to fulfill. St. Teresa of Calcutta gave up much, but she gained infinitely more. God works in our lives. When we look at our priorities in our lives, what does it look like? We can look at our calendar. We can look at the way we spend our money from our checkbooks or our credit cards. That's a litmus test of what our priorities are in our lives. Is Jesus even in there? He wants to be first. He wants to be most important. Not because he's jealous, but because he knows that's where we will find the most joy. Because our joy comes not in grasping and holding on to Crete, but in letting go and serving others, serving God, putting Him first. As I wrote in my bulletin article last weekend, if you read that, it's still online in case you need to see it. We're starting as a parish 1 million acts of mercy. We got this nice stuff over here on the side. If you're in the back and you can't see, you'll have to come up at some point and check it out that we have on the side. And back here, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be putting up a puzzle. and 1 piece for every 1,000 acts of mercy. At the entrances and in the bulletin we have these little sheets that you can fill out. No names, please. We don't want to, it's not like trying to get credit for anything. But just how many times throughout the week have you done the corporal or the spiritual works of mercy? Praying for the living and the dead, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, whatever it may be. And it has a list of them there. And if you've forgotten what they are, in the bulletin today we also have an insert about what the spiritual and corporal works of mercy are. And so you write down throughout the course of the week or however long, how many times you've done each of them as an individual, as a family. And then you drop it in the basket or you mail it in. And for every 1,000 works of mercy, we'll put up another piece of the puzzle. And it's a 1,000-piece puzzle. And so when we get to the finish of the puzzle, we'll have 1,000,000 works, 1,000,000 acts of mercy by our parish. But that's not just the end. It's supposed then to become part of our everyday lives. That this becomes our habit. So that's one way that we put God first as we show mercy, the mercy of God to others. Another thing that we're going to be doing is there's a consecration to merciful love. You may remember that we've done the consecration to the heart of Mary going to Jesus through the 33 days of morning glory. Well, Father Gately wrote another book, 33 Days to Merciful Love, and so we're inviting you to participate in that as well. With that, we're going to start in a couple of weeks, praying at home, and then on the 34th day, which is going to be October 22nd, the feast of John Paul II, we consecrate ourselves to the merciful love of Jesus. This is via St. Therese of Lisieux and her theology, which, incidentally, Mother Teresa, St. Teresa of Calcutta, took her name from St. Therese of Lisieux. And so I invite you to do that as well. We're going to be having the books available next weekend. But my sisters and brothers, I invite you to examine the mercy in your life, reaching out to put God first, and from putting God first, then reaching out in love to those around us.